Welcome to Rebuilding Rob, the podcast, the show that's dedicated to the relentless pursuit of building a more perfect man. I am your host, your favorite blogger turned podcaster. My name is Rob, and on this week's episode, I'm going to talk to you about the greatest teacher of all. And no, that's not a shameless plug for myself. So stay tuned. Okay, so before I get into the real meat and potatoes of today's episode, I suppose I would be a little bit remiss if I wasn't talking about the big news story today out of Washington. Earlier this morning, the House of Representatives voted to pass a bill which is called the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary Controlled Applications Act. This is a kind of blinding speed that this particular version of Congress is moving with, because this bill actually had just come out from the House Energy and Commerce Committee last week. So to go from a committee to a vote on the House floor in less than a week is pretty surprising, all things considered. If you haven't heard about this, basically what this bill could potentially do is ban TikTok from being available on app stores in the United States. So it would not be available on the Android App Store or the Apple App Store. In effect, this would actually ban TikTok in the United States. Now, I don't know how that would affect people who already have the application downloaded to their phone. There was an incident going back to, I believe it was last year. I'm sorry, it was back in 2020 when Donald Trump signed an executive order that basically did the same thing, in that it also took TikTok off of the app stores in the United States. However, in that case, it did not affect people who already had the app downloaded, existing users. So I suspect that the same thing would probably happen if this bill goes to pass. But what is really at stake here is basically Washington is concerned about the fact that TikTok is a subsidiary or a part of a Chinese company called ByteDance. Now, ByteDance does call itself a private company. In fact, they are not even based out of China at all. What they have done, and forgive me here because I had to do a lot of research. I actually wrote a post about this last week on my blog called The Curious Case of TikTok. I wrote this one just as the bill had been passed through one of the House committees last week. So, as I mentioned, TikTok, is a subsidiary of a company called ByteDance. Now, this company claims to be privately owned, company based out of China. Again, the company is based out of Beijing, but they are actually registered as a business in the Cayman Islands, which apparently this is not unusual for privately owned Chinese companies. And as for TikTok itself, it has headquarters both in Singapore and in Los Angeles. TikTok's CEO, a man by the name of Shou Zi Chew, was born in Singapore and he studied abroad, including at Harvard University here in America. Incidentally, Mr. Chew is married to an American citizen and he has children who are American citizens. He himself, however, is a citizen of Singapore. There was a clip online, you could probably find it, where he was getting grilled today by some of the congressmen about his citizenship. They were asking if he was a member of the Chinese Communist Party, and he explained, no, I'm a citizen of Singapore. I actually served in the military in Singapore for 2 years, yada, yada, yada. Now, really what's at stake here, the whole controversy surrounding TikTok, is about whether or not TikTok is sharing user information, specifically Americans' personal information, with the Chinese government. Chew claims that he has not shared any of that information for American users with the Chinese government, and he has said that if he was asked to share it, he would refuse. Now, being that TikTok is a subsidiary of a Chinese company, I don't really know how a Chinese business would be able to say no to the Chinese government, considering how their reputation for being strict and oppressive as they are. But I could say the same thing really about any government. I'm not sure how a private business would say no to a government unless they want to run the risk of going out of business in that country, which we may be very well on the way to with this situation currently with TikTok. Now, what Washington wants is they actually want ByteDance to divest TikTok or actually get rid of TikTok. They want TikTok to branch off and be a separate entity or a separate company. And in doing that, it would actually separate TikTok from any ties or possible ties to the Chinese government. Now, there are theories that there are laws in China that actually require Chinese companies to secretly give data to the Chinese government when it is requested. But again, Mr. Chu claims that he has not been asked by the Chinese government to turn over this information. And to be honest, TikTok's ties to China are, kind of like, it's kind of like being with your third cousin. It's a couple generations removed. But that's really the rub. That's really the heart of the matter is we don't know exactly what would happen if the Chinese government asked TikTok for that user information, which is why Washington wants to see TikTok branch off and become its own separate entity. Now, with this bill that passed today, basically TikTok has 5 months to separate itself from ByteDance. If that does not happen, then the app would be banned on US app stores, including the Android store and the Apple store. So this is a story that is still developing, continuing to develop. It's interesting because there are about 170 million TikTok users in the United States alone. I use TikTok not a lot. I do have a personal account for my real life identity, and I do have a account for my blog here. You can check that out at Rebuilding Rob if you're looking for me. Shameless plug. But the reason I bring this up is because for the last few days, TikTok has already been putting videos and ads into their feed, explaining to people, hey, call your congressman, write your congressman, tell them about your experiences with TikTok, tell them that you don't want us to get shut down, etc., etc. I don't know what's going to happen. I was actually watching a video that Chu had posted to TikTok through TikTok's official account just before I started recording this podcast tonight. And the way he sounds, he doesn't sound as if he's really looking to have TikTok branch off from ByteDance. Maybe this is just a game of chicken at this point. Maybe as we get closer to that 5-month deadline coming to a close, maybe we'll see some last-minute decisions being pulled. But as I always say, stay tuned. I will have more as it develops. Okay, so getting back to the proper business at hand, we had gotten a prompt last week on the old WordPress machine that was asking us the question, how has a failure or an apparent failure set you up for later success? So I heard this prompt and my first thought immediately went to the Star Wars movie, The Last Jedi. There's a scene where the spirit of Yoda, the Force ghost or the Force spirit, if you will, the kind of bluish translucent version of the character, was talking to Luke Skywalker. And he said a great line, probably the greatest line to come out of the Disney sequel trilogy. Yoda had said, "The greatest teacher failure is." And of course, obviously that's in the backwards Yoda talk, but you get the point. Yoda was trying to tell Luke that in life, failure is the greatest teacher we have. And for this prompt, my mind immediately went to three things in my life that were probably failures, or, at least I perceive them as failures to begin with, but they ultimately led to better things. First thing I want to talk about on that is my first stint as a teacher. Now, I don't know, I may have told the story before, but back in 2004, X1 and I were both in the teaching business, and we decided to move to South Carolina. Teaching jobs were pretty hard to find up here in Michigan, so we made our move down there. I was there, we were there for 3 years up to this point, and I was teaching the whole time, and it didn't really go very well for me. X1 really took pretty well to teaching when she was there, kind of like a fish in water. With me, it was a little bit more of a struggle. I'm not going to get into scapegoating it or blaming any reasons for it, but the fact of the matter is, it didn't work for me. And at the end of my third year, after I was unsuccessful in my teacher evaluation, the state of South Carolina was not going to update my provisional teaching certificate without a successful evaluation score. So at that point, I was pretty much out of a job and I was SOL. I think part of my problem when I was originally going into teaching is I'm a nice guy. I try hard not to be too nice. I'm not the teacher's buddy. I'm not their friend. But I had a pretty thick skin to things. I let a lot of crap slide. Classroom management wasn't my forte necessarily. Now, most people who've been in this business for any length of time will tell you that basically, unless you're some kind of wunderkind or some uber teacher, the first 5 years that you're in the business, like any other profession pretty much, you're going to suck at it. That's just the way that it goes. So I was a little disappointed that I didn't even make it to 5 years at that point. I think that some of my typical early teaching struggles were only exacerbated by the fact that X1 and I were 800 miles away from our family, our friends, and any support network that I had. I did get out of the profession, as I said, and there were a couple other things that I wanted to try, so I did knock around a little bit. And my problem at that point was our marriage started going south. I felt like I was on a proverbial island, if you will. I was kind of out there drifting all alone. At this point was when I started talking to a counselor to get some help with my anxiety, and I was starting to realize how much being away from home and everything was affecting me. So, as I've explained before, our marriage ended. She asked for a divorce. I made the decision to return to Michigan since I was underemployed and I had better job opportunities up here. And when I got here, I had to get my feet back under me. The career I wanted to go into, the career of my dreams had ended. My marriage had ended. My son and I were separated by a distance of 800 miles. And I knew that I wanted to get back in the game. At this point, I had already done my brief student teaching stint in South Carolina and when I made the decision to get back. So once I was back in Michigan, I got back into school to get my Michigan certificate updated. My plan at the time was to get the Michigan certificate updated and then return to South Carolina. And I did. I got my Michigan certificate. Obviously, I met X2. That all happened. So I stayed here in Michigan. And while I was here, I started taking some jobs in, to be honest, really some bad schools. And in some cases, they were bad school districts. Or in other cases, they were just in really bad neighborhoods. But it was a real sink or swim situation for me. I kind of looked at some of the jobs as I had as almost my New York moment. If I can make it there, I can make it anywhere. And that's kind of how I treated it. It was a real baptism of fire, if you will. So, as much and as discouraging as the end result of my teaching tenure in South Carolina was, I know that I would not be where I am today. I would not be teaching in the school district where I am today. And I would not be doing what I'm doing. And that includes talking to you guys out here if I didn't go through that experience of that first false start in South Carolina. As for the next failure in my life, and again, you have to take this term failure with a grain of salt. And you'll have to pardon me. I know I've spoke about my teaching situation before, and I know obviously I've talked about my divorce before. Hell, that's the whole purpose of my blog, was really getting into men's issues pertaining to divorces. That's really what was the genesis of the whole thing. So the next failure, if you will, that I'm going to discuss was my marriage, or more to the point, my divorce. As I think I've explained before, I was married for 11 and a half years. And in the last segment, I was talking about a little bit about how my marriage started to come to an end. But going through my divorce, going through the whole experience of leaving South Carolina, coming back to Michigan, it taught me really what marriage is and what marriage is not supposed to be. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Moving 800 miles away from Kid One was the hardest thing that I ever have or I ever will do in my life. That first summer in particular that I was back in Michigan and I was away from Kid One was devastating to me. I started drinking pretty heavily. I got to a point where I was probably drinking just about every night of the week, and I was going out to social events probably at least 2, 3, 4 nights a week, whether it was going out with a group of people to a bar, going to one of the events that the local social club was putting on, going to bowling with them, or going to kickball, all of which involved alcohol. I would be lying if I told you that I didn't have a couple of incidents where I drank too much too fast and I blacked out. I specifically remember a time where I was behind the wheel of a car. I missed my turn to get home, and I almost ended up at a Air National Guard base that is about 6 miles east of my house. That would have been an absolute disaster if I didn't get my shit together. But even while I was drinking at this point, I started going to the gym. Initially, I started just walking around my subdivision, and then when I had the money, I got a gym membership. And I was liking the results. It felt good. And part of it was I liked the feeling of working out until I was in pain, because once I was pain, my muscles were sore, it was something else for me to think about beyond how much I was hurt for missing my son. Eventually, and I've talked about this ad nauseum before, once I met X2, I was still drinking at that time, and we had an incident one night celebrating her birthday. That was kind of my rock bottom moment. I went sober for almost a year at that point. I continued to work out, and I started to see much better results at that point. But I bring up the working out and the drinking because this led to me feeling better and gaining new levels of confidence as I started to go to the gym. I've never really been a gym guy per se, but I got to a point where I was going 5 or 6 days a week to the gym. I was going there sometimes north of an hour, sometimes north of an hour and a half. And as most of you out there who've ever been to a gym will understand this next point that I'm going to make, I got to the point where I was confident enough to go to that other corner of the gym where the free weights are at. You know the area I'm talking about. You know where all the muscle heads are at. The guys with their cut-off sweatshirts and their arms that are so big they can't even put them down at their side. These are usually the dudes who also carry a 1-gallon jug of water around. I went over there. I didn't look anything like them. I just don't have that cell structure. But I was comfortable and I was confident enough to hang over there and actually work out over there. And one last thing also regarding my divorce. My divorce is also what gave birth to my blog and this very podcast that you're listening to now. So if it wasn't for my divorce, neither this podcast nor my blog would exist. All right, as for my third failure in life, because things like this have to come in threes, I would probably have to look to the end of my long term relationship with X2. As I've mentioned before, X2 and I were together off and on for a total of 7 years. We were engaged on a couple of occasions, but obviously we did not make it down the aisle. And it's interesting that I bring this up today because the last couple of days were the fourth anniversary of the pro sports in the United States shutting down due to the COVID breakout. And I believe the next day was when we started getting the first lockdowns in the United States. I bring that up because it was right about that time that X2 and I broke up for good. We had broken up just before the lockdown started, in fact. And this was a tough one for me, the end of my relationship with X2. I really wanted this relationship to work. I tried so hard to make it work. I think, and this took me a long time to really figure out and come to terms with, but I think the reason I wanted this relationship to work so bad, or that I kept hanging on when, quite frankly, I could tell it was a sinking ship, was because after my divorce, I felt like I had to make it work this time. I felt like I might not get another shot at this, and I needed to make it work. And as I mentioned, this took me a long time to figure out. I was still hung up on X2 for a long time. Not that I was still in love with her, but I felt like there was this hold that she had on me still. Again, not that I was still in love with her, but I couldn't move forward, and it took me a lot of introspection, and it took me a lot of talking to Lomax, my counselor, to really figure out that it was because I was holding on as tight as I was. I somehow got it into my mind as this relationship was going down in flames that I had to make it work. I had to dig in, and I had to find a way to fix it. If my marriage taught me, if my divorce taught me what a marriage is and is not supposed to be, or what a relationship is or is not supposed to be, my long term relationship with X2 taught me what I would, and more to the point, and more importantly, what I would not put up with in a relationship. And over these last, I don't know, few months that I've been single, I mean, I've gone on a couple of dates and stuff, but I'm really entering a point in my life right now where I've realized that having a girlfriend or a fiance or a wife is not the end all be all of all human existence. The end of my relationship, my long term relationship with X2, really forced me to remember how to be happy with myself and how to be by myself. And quite frankly, to figure out just who in the hell I was again. Yoda was right when he said that failure is the greatest teacher of all. Failure teaches us to be really introspective and forces us to dig deeper, to push ourselves, to figure out what is not working and how to fix it. And I talk a lot about adversity and how we learn so much through adversity. And what I've noticed recently, and I'm even noticing it with Kid One lately, that I feel like a lot of people who don't deal with any adversity in their lives, when you don't have those moments where you do fail and you have to dig deep and you have to find a way to push through and succeed, I feel that those people who never really have those kind of moments, they tend to panic when it finally happens to them. And you know what I mean. I'm talking about the people who seem like everything goes their way. They always seem to catch a break. Call it luck, call it karma, whatever you want to call it. things just seem to go their way, or everything comes up Milhouse, as they say on The Simpsons. But when they have that moment, when they finally hit the wall and something doesn't work, it's almost like they don't know how to dig deep. They don't know how to push through. They don't know how to overcome that adversity because they've never had to. And sometimes these are people who are so naturally talented at stuff that they've never really had to work at it, which is kind of a shame. And listen, I'm not wishing the experiences I had on anybody. I've said it before and I'll say it again. I'm kind of sick of starting over with my career, with my living situation, with relationships. I'm kind of sick of starting over and over again. But these experiences I've had, these failures that I had, taught me so much about myself. And I don't think I would have learned these lessons any other way. All right, well, that's going to do it for this week's episode of the show. Be sure to tune in next week when our topic is to be decided. Ooh, that sounds mysterious. In the meantime, remember you can always reach us at the blog www.rebuildingrob.com. This podcast is also available on Spotify for podcasters, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, as well as the iHeartRadio app. New episodes appear almost every Wednesday. Just search for us under the title, Rebuilding Rob, the podcast. In the meantime, my name is Rob, and I will look forward to seeing you next week.